Good evening, and thank you for attending our online EQ educational session. I'm just letting a few people in as we start. My name is Melinda, and I'm a Senior Sport Development Officer with Equestrian, Queensland. Tonight, we will be discussing feeding for purpose with Holly Mills from Hygain. I'd like to also let you know that this session will be recorded. Holly is an equine nutrition advisor with Hygain Feeds. She's been with Hygain for almost 2 years now and has an absolute passion for equine nutrition. Holly holds a Bachelor in Animal Science and is currently undertaking a Masters of Equine Nutrition. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Holly and we can get underway.
All right. Hello, everyone. Melinda, can you let me know if you can hear me okay?
Yes, perfect. Thank you, Holly.
Beautiful. All right. I shall share my screen. Okay. Now, can everyone see that? Hopefully.
Yes.
Beautiful.
Yes, looks great.
All right. Well, as Melinda has just introduced, my name's Holly. I might have chatted with a few of you before. I'm an equine nutrition advisor for Hygain and Mitavite as well. Basically, my job is realistically just helping people feed their horses and get the absolute best that they can from their horses. But I do lots of different things, and one of those things is education, just like this program. So I hope you get something out of tonight. And if you've got any questions, you can just leave them in the chat. If I see them pop up, I'll answer them as I go. Otherwise, definitely get to them at the end. Cool. So I just like to start off with a little bit about who is Hygain and Mitavite. So we were established in 1983. Hygain was established in 1983, and we're located in Officer in Victoria down here. That's our original mill, and it's still where most of our horse feed is made today. We employ over 150 different people, and that includes most of the states and territories across Australia, as well as in New Zealand. And we also have an office and a team in America as well. We are an equine-only feed mill, and that's really important to us because it means that there are no things that go into our mill that might contaminate our horse feed. So things that do go into chicken and cow feed can actually be toxic to horses. So being an equine-only feed mill, that means there's no risk of contamination. And we export to over 26 different countries, including New Zealand and America, but also lots of other countries as well. So we make a lot of horse feed. And a fun fact, I suppose, we're actually the largest manufacturer of racehorse feed in the world. So we feed a lot of racehorses, but we feed all different types of horses, down from your little pony club ponies all the way up to Olympic horses as well. And just a fun fact about me, this is my one horsey, but he's a thoroughbred, and that's realistically all anyone needs to know about him. Cool. So just thought I'd give a little bit of an overview for tonight. We're talking about feeding for purpose. So I'm going to touch on what we are actually feeding our horse, what's actually going into their bucket, what are they eating every single day. We're going to talk about specific ingredients and what they're actually used for, and particularly ingredients that provide energy for work and for condition as well, because I know quite a few of you people, or a lot of people that are competing with Equestrian Queensland have horses obviously in work. And then we're going to talk about some key areas of the actual feed bag itself, because I do believe that it's really important that we have a little bit of an understanding on how to actually read and extract information from that feed bag. We give that to you guys for a reason, so that you can actually take some of those key messages away and make sure that you are choosing the right feed for your horse. So I just want to make sure that everyone has a good understanding of how we can actually read that feed bag and take away those key messages. And we're also going to touch on what we need to remember when we are actually feeding our horse as well. So that's taking it right back to basics, but something that we always need to be keeping in mind when we are choosing a feed for our horse. So starting off, let's talk about what we are actually feeding the horse, what's actually going in the bucket. This is what we would describe as a macronutrient or a source of fuel. So macro meaning a large nutrient. So the things that really make up that horse's diet. So generally we refer to 4 different macronutrients, and you can find that any horse's diet is actually made up of some ratio of these 4 ingredients. And that actually includes manufactured feeds as well. So all manufactured feeds contain some sort of ratio of these 4 ingredients. You'll find a high fiber diet will be something suitable for a horse that might be a little bit busy, or also a horse that might have laminitis. A high starch diet might be something for a horse that requires quite a lot of energy, or might be a little bit lazy, or something that's working quite hard. A high protein diet you might find for a horse that might be young and growing, and a high fat diet might be for something that might be a little bit skinny. So these are the 4 things that make up what your horse eats every single day, and every single feed within that feed room that you go into to purchase your horse's feed is made up of some ratio of these 4 ingredients. So it's important as horse owners we have an understanding of what these ingredients are actually doing for our horse. So the first one is fiber. Now fiber is obviously the most important part of our horse's diet. So that includes anything from things like grass or hay, but also legume hulls or beet pulp or things that we would class as super fibers as well. So as you all should know as horse owners, horses are designed to eat fiber. That is literally how their digestive system works. It is designed to work continuously and always be breaking down lots and lots of fiber. They literally evolved as grazing, wandering herbivores. They have a requirement for fiber, so we generally recommend a minimum of 1.5% of their body weight. Now, for example, a 500 kilo horse, that's about 7.5 kilos per day. Unfortunately, we find this is the area where most horse owners might be, or not most horse owners, but it's one of the most common mistakes that we see, is that horse owners will unfortunately not provide sufficient roughage for their horse. So it's something that we need to be super aware of to make sure that our horse is actually meeting this requirement. So sources, like I said, anything from basic sort of pasture, if you're lucky enough to have lots of pasture, and a horse that can tolerate pasture, of course, or we can also supplement that pasture with hay or even chaff. Now, we tend to make up that 1.5% of their body weight from what we would call long stem roughage, so something like the pasture or the hay, because that requires lots of chewing and it takes a longer time for them to break down, which is really good for their digestive system. We can use things like chaff and beet pulp to make up that 1.5% if you've got a horse with no teeth, but otherwise these are things that we would consider sort of supplementary fiber sources. The type of energy that fiber provides our horse, because anything we feed does have sort of an energy sort of content, we would consider this slow release energy. It takes a long time for fiber to get through that horse's digestive system. And it's actually really broken down in that second part of that horse's digestive system by the microbes that live in the hindgut. So it takes a long time for that horse to extract that energy. So it's quite a cool source of energy for that horse. So it's perfect for any horses that might be a little bit hot or might be a little bit too energetic. If you want to keep something nice and cool, we choose a diet that's quite high in fiber. Now, like I said, it's really important that we do keep an eye on our horses' fiber intake because that's a requirement for life for them. And nowadays, unfortunately, the horses have reduced access to traditional pastures. They're no longer grazing acres and acres of fields. They're often in restricted sort of paddocks. So we do need to make sure that we are providing that. The other thing that we need to consider as well is that these horses are now in work. They're no longer just, wild horses doing whatever they might want to do with their day. We are now actually asking them to work. So we might actually also need to consider supplementing their diet with something a little bit higher in energy to help meet that requirement for work and also maintain their condition as well. So we've got their fiber in their diet. We could also consider adding something like starch. So we generally add starch into a horse's diet when we're looking for energy and weight or condition. Okay, some people can be really scared when we start talking about the word starch. They immediately think that it's bad. I wouldn't immediately label starch as negative, but it's a tool that we can use. Okay, so if we are really looking for energy and weight, something like starch can really help us achieve that. It's just something that we have to be aware of, and we just need to make sure that we're using it appropriately. So sources of starch are anything like cereal grains. So oats, corn, barley, or wheat. This is a picture of micronized corn here. This is micronized barley. And then this is a cereal grain-based feed. So this is a feed called Track Talk, which has oats in it as well. Now, the type of energy that starches provide is rapid energy or powerful energy. So this is a good option if you've got a particularly lazy horse and you're looking to add in a little bit of extra energy, or for a hard-working horse. So commonly we will see starches in the diet of something like a racehorse, but also high-level eventers as well. So those horses are working quite hard and they need to make sure that they've got the energy for that work as well. So occasionally too, we might have the lazy dressage horse that we might want to add a little bit of pep into their step. But there's many different types of horses where we might consider adding starch. But that's definitely a situation that we need to consider the horse themselves and also the rider as well, what they're actually wanting to achieve, because we want to make sure that everyone stays nice and safe. We don't want to give lots of starch to a horse that might already be quite energetic. Now, we also need to keep in mind that starch is not suitable for a horse that might have laminitis or Cushing's or any sort of metabolic disease, okay? So if we've got a nice healthy horse, starch is okay, but if we've got anything with metabolic disease, we definitely want to stay away from the starches. Cool, so now we've got some fibre and maybe some starch in our horse's diet. We can also look at adding some protein. So protein is actually a requirement of the horse, so just like it is for you and I, and it's generally quite low in starch. So protein is used to build muscles. Most people know that, if they want to increase top line in their horse, they tend to add some extra protein. But protein is also essential for just building new connective tissues as well, but also different little functions within the body as well. So not just for muscles, it's an absolute requirement of that horse, and they require a good quality source of protein as well, because protein is made up of lots of different puzzle pieces, and if you don't have enough of all the essential puzzle pieces, you can't create the perfect puzzle. So we need to make sure that they do have a good quality source of protein in their diet. So options for protein could be anything like soybean meal, lupins, tick beans, but also things like lucerne hay. So a lot of people are quite familiar with lucerne hay. That actually comes from a legume as well, so things like lupins and legumes. And lucerne hay is a great quality source of protein. And generally the type of energy is quite slow. The body doesn't use protein as a preferred source of energy. It would much rather use the fibre and the starches as energy. Protein is sort of a last resort, but it can be converted. So it's generally quite a slow source of energy, whereas it is a need for all horses, okay? So they do have a requirement for great quality sources of proteins. This is a picture of lupins here, and this is a picture of munga, which is a high protein feed, so 25% protein munga. The purpose, like I said, generally we're adding protein into a horse's diet, or we would have a higher protein feed. If we are looking to encourage that muscle line building and top line development, now keeping in mind you build muscles in the gym by working out nice and hard, and it's just the same with your horse as well. They realistically build those muscles when they're working, but we need to make sure that we provide them with those essential amino acids, with those puzzle pieces to actually form that muscle as well. And you'll often see that young horse or sales prep feeds are also higher in protein because those horses are young and developing, and we do also want to encourage that muscle development as well. All right, so now we've got fiber in our diet. We've got maybe some starches if we're looking for some energy or some weight. And we've got some protein because our horse needs that. And we could also consider adding in some fats or some oils. So we might do that because fats are highly digestible and they're actually a great source of energy for horses, okay? So they're very energy dense because they're a liquid, and that makes it quite easy to add into your horse's feed as well because, as you will probably know, horses actually have quite small stomachs, so we don't want to give them really large sources of food. So an oil is a good option because it's a liquid, just blends in with everything else. It doesn't actually make the feed size any bigger. So sources of fats or oil is pretty much any type of oil. So that could be rice bran oil, flaxseed oil, fish oil, canola oil, or any type of seed as well. So flax seeds themselves are obviously a source of fat as well. The type of energy that a fat provides is quite slow and cool, okay? So again, if you've got a hot horse, this is also a good energy source. Or if you've got a horse that needs a little bit of condition as well, fats are really great at adding condition to horses. So there's usually, like I said, they're usually used for something like weight gain, but they can also be used for omega-3 fatty acids. They're not just a good source of energy for a cool horse as well. Keep in mind, they can be used with all horses. Lots of race horses will be using fat as a source of energy because they kind of act as, I guess, a longer, more sustained source of energy rather than sugars and starches. So, you know, fat will keep a horse going for quite a long period of time and sugars and starches will provide power. So we have two types of oils, and sometimes people ask me what's the difference between these oils. So RBO, for example, is our rice bran oil, and that one is the oil that I would normally recommend for weight gain if you're looking for condition, just because it's quite a palatable oil, so horses generally don't mind eating it. Particularly if you are looking for condition or quite a bit of extra energy, you can actually add up to 250 mils of oil into the horse's diet. So a full cup, which can be quite a bit of oil if the horse isn't used to that. So using a palatable oil is a good option. And the other reason why RBO is a good option for weight gain is because it actually contains a compound called gamma-oryzanol, which has been shown to encourage muscle development. So if you do have a fussy horse or you're looking for condition, RBO is a good option. And then Performer 3 is the option that we would consider adding if you're looking for omega-3 fatty acid benefits. This is actually a blend of oils, so it contains canola, fish, and flaxseed oil. Now, the biggest question I get around Performer 3 is why do we put fish oil in a horse's feed? And the reason why we do that is because it contains two omega-3 fatty acids called EPA and DHA, and those are actually the form of omega-3 fatty acids that horse will utilize. So if you use a plant-based oil like flaxseed, it will provide something called ALA, which has to be converted within that horse's body. And the conversion process is quite poor. So you'll find that you need quite a bit of flaxseed oil, quite a lot of ALA to get a small amount of EPA and DHA. So Performer 3 oil makes sure that the horse is getting all three, and is able to use some of those omega-3 fatty acids right away. So that's fats and oils, which, like I said, we can use for weight gain, or we can use for omega-3 fatty acid benefits, or we can also use for long sustained energy sources. So just as a little bit of an overview, remember we've got fiber, which is essential. So something like our hay or our pasture. We've got starches, which is providing us with energy, which comes from cereal grains like corn or barley. And we've got protein, which again is essential. So something like lupins or lucin, good source of protein. And then we've got fats or oils, which is a slow release sort of energy, and can also be used for weight gain. So this is what our horse's diet is made up of. Cool. So now we know that, Let's look at reading the back of the bag. Now, this is something that I think is really important, and I do lots of these talks all across the country, and I find the number one thing realistically is that a lot of people also do not read the back of the bag or have never turned it over before. And it's something that I do think is quite important because it gives you a lot of information. Now, we're always happy to provide diet advice, but if you just want to go into the feed room and have a look for yourself, I'm hoping that I can equip you with some of the tools to actually look at some of this information and make sense of some of this information yourselves. So we've just gone through those 4 macronutrients: the fiber, the starch, the protein, and the fat. Now let's see them on the back of our bags. So I've actually got a couple of bag examples here, but as we go along, by the end of it, I will identify what the bags are so you can get an idea for what types of feeds they are. So as you go along, think to yourself, is this a feed that's suitable for a horse that needs more energy? Is it a feed that's suitable for a horse that needs less energy? Okay. Hopefully with some of the information that I just provided, you will be able to sort of make a little bit of a guess, I suppose. So remember we were just talking about protein. So you can see here, each of these feeds list their protein sources. So for example, this pink one here is 25% protein compared to this gold one here, which is only 15% protein. So you can actually see this is quite a high protein feed. So maybe if you were going into the store looking for something that might boost top line development or encourage muscle development, or maybe for a young horse, maybe this might be the option for you. You can see that this one is a fat content of 4% and this pink one is a fat content of 12.5%. So again, this is actually quite high in fat. So maybe if you are looking for a little bit of condition boost, this would be the option that you would choose. And then if we were looking at fiber, you can see this one is about 35% fiber, which is super high in fiber. And then down here, this is a max of 10%, which is quite low. So if you had a horse that was quite hot, we know that fiber is cool, slow release source of energy. So maybe this would be the feed you would pick. And if you've got a horse that needs lots of energy, then maybe this would be the feed that you would pick, because generally if something is lower in fiber, it's higher in starch. And starch is what provides us with those energy sources. So just something that you can identify when you're turning those back of the bags over. I'm not expecting everyone to walk out here and know exactly what percentage their fat, fiber, protein should be. But I want you to be able to turn around and say, oh yes, I know what fat is used for. I know what protein is used for. I know what fiber is used for. I can understand those macro ingredients. And then if you really need some more nitty-gritty sort of information, then you can absolutely reach out. But I just want you to feel a little bit more comfortable around what's actually going into your horse's diet. So the other thing that we would definitely want to look at when we are identifying key areas of the bag would actually be the ingredient listing. So this is where we're, again, looking for those macronutrients. So this is when we need to also identify what type of horse we have. So if we are looking for muscle development, then we are potentially looking for a higher protein feed. So you can also look for ingredients as well. So something like lupins, sunflower seeds are a source of protein, lucerne, again, lupins, sunflower seeds, you can see those are quite staple, high protein, quality protein sources of ingredients. Also soybean meal and canola meal and fava beans. So they're good quality sources of protein. When we're looking at fats, you can look on the back of the bag, anything that's an oil, like we were saying before, good source of fat. So you might see things like rice bran oil, canola oil, or rice bran oil again. Those are pretty common sources of fats within a horse's diet. If you're looking for fiber sources, now they're sometimes not super obvious on the backs of feeds, but most of the time it'll be something like listed as a hull. So any sort of hull of a grain is a good source of fiber. So it could be a legume hull, lucerne obviously being a hay, great quality source of protein, but also a good quality source of fiber, so lucerne meal. And down here you can see I haven't really circled anything because there's not any standout ingredients that are great fiber sources. So this is actually the feed that was a max of 10% fiber. So you can see that it's doesn't have any standout sources. Now keep in mind that, you know, oats will have a fiber content. So everything has some sort of ratio of those 4 ingredients. It's just that nothing in here is what I would consider a major source of fiber, like something like a legume hull I would. We can also look for starch sources. Now, this is something that I think is really important that everybody should be able to identify, because starch is one of those ingredients that you don't want to be surprised by, okay? Because if you want energy, then you want to be able to identify feeds that have got energy. And if you don't want energy, then it's really important to be able to identify that as well, okay? And if you do have a horse with laminitis or EMS, then it's absolutely critical that you can understand ingredients that are high in starch. So we're looking for cereal grains here. So something like barley, or down here you can see oats. This is a dead giveaway. This is Track Talk. You can see oats, barley, and corn. So obviously with this one being Track Talk, it is a very high energy feed, okay, because it's designed for a racehorse. It is something that we can use in the equestrian world. Some eventers are using Track Talk, but it's just something you have to be aware of. If you want energy, then you want to look for these sorts of ingredients. If you don't want so much energy, then you want a feed that doesn't contain any cereal grains. So this one, this pink one here is Munga. And Munga is the high protein feed we were seeing before. So this is the 25% protein. And you can see that there's no cereal grains in this. So this is a good, cool option. And then this one here is actually Cool Vitality. So it does have barley in it, but you can see it doesn't have oats or corn. So this is what I would consider sort of a medium level. It's definitely not a hot option, but it's got enough to help maintain condition, because remember we were saying starch is also good for condition. So Cool Vitality is a good middle sort of ground. Now, the other thing I just want to point out is when we're looking at these cereal grains, you can see that there's another word attached to them, and that's the word micronized, okay? So this is something special that we do. We're not the only company in the world that does that, that's for sure, but it's something that I just wanted to point out so that you can understand what that means as well. So when we're talking about micronizing, what we're talking about is trying to prevent digestive upset, okay? So we're processing our feeds. So micronization is actually a processing technique. Okay, I have had people in the past say, you know, I want the most natural diet as possible. I don't want a processed feed. Now, I'm hoping if any of you do feel that way, that I can convince you otherwise, because I do think processing a horse's feed is actually really important, particularly if we're looking to feed a grain. Okay, so you can just keep in mind that when horses evolved as wandering herbivores, munching on lots of different types of grasses, they weren't finding big bowls of corn or big bowls of barley. They, were grazing on various different types of pastures, okay? So it's not natural for a horse to actually consume big meals of grain. So if we look at unprocessed grains, this is actually the digestibility in the small intestine. Now, if you don't know much about the horse's digestive system, this is something that is important. So the horse's small intestine is where starch is digested. So you can remember S for small goes for S for starch. That's how I try to encourage people to remember that. Because if our starch bypasses our small intestine and ends up in our horse's hindgut at the second half of our horse's digestive system, that actually causes rapid fermentation, which creates gas and lactic acid and heat, and can actually cause death of those microbes within that horse's hindgut. And that can lead to many different issues. It could be gas colic. It could be the fact that that horse isn't putting on condition. You're not really sure why. It could be diarrhea. And one of the worst situations, it could actually be or lead to something like laminitis. So it's really important that our starch stays in our small intestine. So this is the digestibility of the starch in the small intestine of an unprocessed grain. So whole oats are about 82 to 85% digestible. So if you noticed on the Track Talk bag, this actually was not micronized. We don't micronize oats because they are actually quite digestible for a horse. So a good source of energy for our horse. And because they do have a hull, they are actually providing a bit of fiber as well. So oats are pretty good. And then when we're looking at corn, it significantly drops. So about 30 to 40% digestible if the corn is cracked, which means that 60 to 70% of that starch is actually leaching into our horse's hindgut, which can cause that, lactic acid and the gas, and potentially that death of those microbes as well. And then unfortunately, barley is actually probably one of the most popular grains in the horse feeding industry, but it's actually probably one of the worst offenders. So it's the digestibility significantly decreases. Even if we're boiling the barley, for me, 50% still isn't enough. I would like my barley to be a little bit better digested than that. So what we do is we do two different processing techniques. So I was showing you muesli feeds before, which is why they just said micronization. But if I was showing you nuggets like gum nuts or fiber essentials, those are extruded options. So extrusion involves heat and pressure, and obviously it creates these nugget-like feeds, and micronization involves infrared heat, and that's anything that's textured, so anything that's a muesli-style feed. So all of our muesli feeds are micronized. Now, what that does is it actually changes the form of that starch. So it changes it from a grain that wasn't really compatible with the horse's digestive system, and it allows it to be more available for that horse, and actually improves the digestibility to over 90% digestible within that small intestine. So it reduces our risk of that starch ending up in our hindgut and potentially causing damage back there. It also means that our horse is actually able to extract that energy from the feed. So you can imagine that your horse's digestive system is cut in two halves, and that first half of that digestive system is what's feeding your horse directly, and then anything that ends up in the hindgut is feeding those horses' microbes. It's no longer feeding the horse, it's feeding the microbes, and those microbes will create whatever they want to with that feed stuff. So if we really want our horse to extract that energy, it needs to be digested in the small intestine. So we need to make sure that it's a nice and digestible source of starch for them. And obviously we want to protect the hindgut. So if you are looking for a higher energy feed, I definitely recommend when you turn that bag over and you look at those ingredients that are in there and you're looking for something with a grain in it, definitely recommend something that has been micronized or extruded to make sure that we are protecting that horse's hindgut and still achieving those energy levels that we're definitely looking for with those horses. Cool. So what other information might we need from the back of our bag? This may actually be the most important piece of information that I would suggest you definitely take a look at. And that is actually the feeding guide. Now, again, I know so many people have never turned their bags over and so many people have never looked at the feeding guide, but this is actually a key piece of information because it actually ensures that your horse is able to meet its vitamin and mineral requirements alongside its roughage. So all of our feeds are designed to meet your horse's vitamin and mineral requirements when fed according to the guidelines, okay? And obviously alongside their roughage. So this is an example. I'm going to show you 3 examples to explain that there are actually 3 different categories of feed depending on the metabolism of your horse. So I'm sure everyone's heard of a good doer, the normal doer, and the poor doer. So if you don't know, every single feed within the feed room can actually be split into those 3 categories. So this first one is an example of a concentrate feed. So this is actually balanced. Now, you can see here that the feeding rate for a dry mare or an early pregnant mare, that's just a spelling horse, really. I could have circled the spelling down here. So about 500 grams per day for them for a concentrate feed. Concentrate meaning that you can feed a small amount of it and get lots of nutrients. So this one is perfect for your good doer. And then we could also look at a feed. This is what we would consider a semi-concentrate. So this is where the feeding rate increases slightly. So then we're looking at a horse that maybe we could consider this horse a normal doer, so something in the middle, so about 1.5 kilos per day. Now, keeping in mind when you are looking at the feeding guide, you need 2 pieces of information. You need to have an understanding of how much your horse weighs and also the type of work that they are in, okay? Because obviously as workload increases, the amount of nutrients that that horse requires actually increases as well. So if you've got a horse in like regular or strenuous work, that's becoming an athlete. Now, I know I certainly don't eat as much as what an Olympic runner does. They need more energy and they need more nutrients than I do because I don't do that much exercise, let's be honest. So it's exact same for your horse. If you have a horse in lots of work, make sure you are matching that workload and that feeding guide to what you're actually providing your horse. And then we can have another type of feed, something that we would consider a full feed. Now, this is a feed that's really designed for a poor doer. So anything that's sitting, this says 2 to 3 kilos per day, but you can always obviously go beyond that with a full feed to help maintain their best condition. So this is really important that you do have an understanding of what your feed is actually recommending, because if you turn your full feed bag over, so this is Cool Vitality, if you turn Cool Vitality over and read that it says you should be feeding 2 to 3 kilos per day, but you're actually giving it 500 grams, that means that a horse on 500 grams of Cool Vitality might actually not be meeting all of its vitamin and mineral requirements. And that actually tells me that your horse should be unbalanced. Okay, so we need to make sure that we are matching the amount that we are feeding to maintain our horse's condition actually matches the feeding guide. So that ensures that they are meeting those vitamin and mineral requirements.
Holly, just to interrupt for a moment, sorry. I've got a few questions here on the chat. Can I ask them now or do you prefer them later?
Whatever's easier. Is it some of them relevant to this?
Yes, so one was asking about the 250 ml of oil. Is that per day?
Yeah, so you can feed, generally, to be honest, we're pretty conservative. So with the 250 mils of oil, that can absolutely be per day. You just need to make sure that you do build up to that. So 250 mils of oil is almost equivalent to a full kilo worth of hard feeding calories. And if you do it too quickly, the horse will just get the runs. So just make sure you do build up to that because the digestive system just needs time to get used to it. But you definitely can feed 250 mils of oil per day.
And the next question is, what is a good high energy feed for a slightly metabolic type performance horse that needs no starch or low starch sugar?
Yeah, okay. So that's actually an incredibly tricky question to answer. And unfortunately, it is a common question that we get. You know, I've got a metabolic horse or something that needs to be careful with its sugars, but they're really lazy and I'm looking for more energy. The best, it's difficult because it's case by case. And I think we'll get into that situation when we go to our next slide and we talk about all the things that are involved in actually selecting a perfect option for your horse. But you could look at something like Munga because it's lower in sugar and starch, but it's really got a great source of vitamins and minerals. So sometimes you'll find those horses, unfortunately, because they've been on a restricted diet, don't have access to great, good quality sources of nutrients. And sometimes that can help boost their energy intake. But it's also got an excellent quality source of protein and a good quality source of fat. So you can use sort of energy from those ingredients rather than using energy from sugars and starches. So yeah, potentially something like Munga, but if we were going to actually create a diet for that horse, I would ask you a lot more questions.
Next question is the molasses that's added to some of these feeds just a small amount for feed palatability, or should we worry it is not so good for the horse that is a good doer?
Yeah, absolutely. So molasses is realistically added for two reasons. One of them is just for moisture. So make sure that the feed's not dusty or anything like that, and your horse is, having a nice experience. And the other is because of palatability. Now, the molasses we use is definitely not the type of molasses that you can buy from the store. So it's not that thick, black sort of molasses. It's actually, you could consider it to be watered down. So it runs through the system nice and easy. So it's actually not as high in sugar as what you might believe. And realistically, there's not much of it added either. So although it might look wet, it might feel wet, that doesn't actually mean that it's got a sugar content. So for example, Munga does contain molasses, but the sugar content is actually quite low considering or compared to most other feeds.
Okay, and the next question is, when hay and pasture is extremely low and hard to find, what is the best way to get enough fibre?
Yeah, so pasture, obviously you can supplement with hay, but then once you get to when hay starts becoming unavailable, that is incredibly difficult, okay? And that is the situation that we are potentially moving into at the moment. And I was discussing it today with some people at work. So even in my local area, we are very wet down here. We do have an abundance of grass, but I can't foresee them cutting hay anywhere in the near future because it's never going to dry out at this point. So we are running out of hay, and not everyone does have pasture. There are ways that you can do it. Unfortunately, it's expensive. So you can use things like fiber fresh, for example. So that's a silage sort of based product that's designed for horses. So that's a way that you can supplement roughage. You could also use chafs if they're available. And you can use things like beet pulp or fiber essentials. But you have to get quite strategic about that because you want to start to slow the horse down because they can eat those smaller sources of fiber quite quickly, and you want the fiber to be drawn out as long as possible. So unfortunately, you have to get a little bit creative if you want to do that. So you might have to use like multiple different buckets. I recommend putting bricks in the bucket so the horses have to move the bricks around and they can't just gobble it all down as quickly as possible. So there are ways of doing it, but it's expensive and challenging for sure.
Okay, that's all the questions. Thank you, Holly.
All right, beautiful. We'll move on and then maybe stop at the end for the rest of them. Cool. So now that we have thought about our 4 macronutrients, so we know that we can use fiber, starch, protein, and fats to create a diet for our horse, and we know how to look for those macronutrients on the back of the bag. We know that starches are for higher energy feeds, and if we want a lower energy feed, we want to stay away from those starches or those cereal grains. And we know that feeding guide is super important to making sure our horse is meeting its nutrient requirements. How do I actually pick a feed? So I always like to bring my talks back to this question just because I think it's super important, whether you're feeding an Olympic horse or the paddock ornament out the back. I think this is it's super basic sort of question, but I think that it's really important that we always bring things back to basics. So the question is just, why does a horse eat? Why are we actually feeding them? What are we actually realistically trying to achieve? And the answer to the question is exactly the same way, or same reason as why you and I eat. So we eat to maintain our weight. So we want to make sure our horse is maintaining their optimum condition. We don't want them too chunky, and we also don't want them too skinny. So we need to feed them to maintain their weight. And we also feed them to meet their vitamin and mineral requirements, okay? So horses, again, just like you and I, have a requirement for vitamins and minerals for all kinds of bodily processes, making sure that everything is working as best it can. So we need to make sure that we provide that to them. And then we also need to make sure that we are feeding them for overall health and well-being. They're an animal, they have a requirement to eat, and we need to make sure that we provide that. So whenever you're putting anything in the bucket or throwing out some hay or moving them to a new paddock, I want you to always keep in mind, I'm doing this to make sure that I'm maintaining my horse's best condition, I'm meeting all of its nutrient requirements, and I'm fulfilling that requirement that they have to eat. So we want everything that we do put in our horse's bucket to fulfill this purpose, and we want everything to actually have a purpose as well. So make sure that if you are putting in 700 supplements, that each of them do have a purpose, and we know why we're adding them in, not just for fun. So I also wanted to quickly take you through the questions that I ask when I am creating a diet, because it kind of gives you an understanding of all the things that I want everyone to consider when they're trying to create a diet for their own horse. And it is really important that we do gather quite a big overview of that horse's diet or that horse's information, because that allows us to really pick the most appropriate option for your horse. So if you walk into a feed store, you'll know that there's about 7 billion different options, and it can be super confusing. But if we have the answers to these questions, we can actually choose the one that's most appropriate for your horse. So if you call up or you email, I will ask you these several questions. So I'll ask you how old your horse is. Now, this is important because if you have a young horse, we need to make sure that we account for growth. So young horses need more nutrients for growth. And if you've got an older horse, we might need to take into consideration that horse's digestive system is potentially starting to slow down, or maybe they've got no teeth left, and we need to think about that. I'll ask about your horse's breed. This won't change too much about that horse's diet, but if you've got a horse that's potentially predisposed, or breed that's predisposed to things like laminitis, obviously I'm not going to recommend a high starch diet. Or if you've got a horse that might be maybe a thoroughbred, they're generally a little bit more energetic, not always, but might also be something that we think about. I'll ask about your horse's weight. Now, if you remember, this is super important because we want to make sure that we're maintaining their optimum weight. So I need to get an understanding of where they're at, because that makes we can guide goals if you have a goal to gain weight or to lose weight. It's also really important because it guides that question around roughage, because we can do that 1.5% calculation with their weight. And finally, it's super important for that feeding guide. So remember that feeding guide on the back of the bag, we need to know how much our horse weighs, and we also need to know their workload. So if they're sitting in the paddock nice and retired, they're not doing too much, their workload's obviously quite low, they don't need as much nutrients as a horse that's competing for the Olympics or running a big race on the weekend. So we need to make sure that we are matching the nutrients to the horse's workload. I'll ask if they've got access to pasture or hay. That can make sure that we can guide conversations around making sure that horse does have access to sufficient roughage. And I can also guide questions around particular different types of hay as well. I'll also ask what you're currently feeding. Now, sometimes people get confused why I ask that. And generally it's because if you're coming to me, normally you've got maybe a problem or something that you want to improve, and I need to establish a benchmark of what might not have been working in the past, or what's potentially not quite working for us now, why we might not be achieving the goals that we want to achieve. So I need to know where we're at so I can guide where we're going. I'll also ask if the horse has any ailments. So that could be anything like metabolic syndrome or laminitis, but it could also be things like maybe they're on box rest and we need to tweak the diet because they might not need so much energy at that time. And any goals for that horse. So if you wanted them to go faster, go slower, get chunkier, slim down, anything like that, we can sort of help to tweak that diet and create suitable options for that horse. So there's lots of different things that really go into selecting that perfect feed for your horse. So if you are creating a diet for your horse, I want you to definitely keep all these sorts of things in your mind so that you can help to choose that. So once we've established all those answers, we can actually ask ourselves the question, does my horse even need a hard feed? Okay. In some situations, maybe not. So this is going back to that situation where I showed that there are actually 3 different categories of feed. So when I go through all of those questions with a horse owner, I will actually categorize that horse as a good doer, a normal doer, a poor doer. And that will help me to choose the feed that fits into one of those categories. So remember, a good doer for a concentrate feed, normal doer for maybe a semi-concentrate feed, and a poor doer, maybe one of those full feeds, okay? So we need to make sure that we've got this information as well so I can choose an appropriate feed for that horse. So we can match those feeding guides on the back. Because sometimes people ask me, how much do we feed? And you feed to maintain your horse's best condition, all right? So always back to that very basic thing. I'm feeding to make sure that I'm meeting nutrient requirements and optimum condition. So if you do find we want to make sure that we are matching our horse's metabolism to the feeding guide on the back of the bag to achieve those 2 things. And then if you really don't need a hard feed at all, if you do really have quite a chunky horse, you can always just use a vitamin and mineral supplement. Roughage only diets are great, but unfortunately, particularly in Australia, they're not always very balanced and they don't always have all the vitamins and minerals as well. So we always recommend adding in a vitamin and mineral supplement. And then just as a note, because I think it's quite important, we always recommend adding salt directly into a horse's diet. Make sure that they're meeting their sodium and chloride requirements, and it does encourage them to drink as well. So we think salt's quite important. Keep your horse nice and hydrated. So we need to remember when we are choosing a feed for our horse, we want optimal weight. So I just wanted to touch on this really quickly. This is what we would consider a body condition score, which goes from, it's supposed to go from 1 to 9, but I don't have all the pictures here. So we want our horse to sit around sort of the middle sort of section. So about a 5 is technically ideal. This 4 looks, to be honest, this is actually probably closer to a 5, and this is probably closer to a 6, and 7, 8, 9. But so we want to make sure that we are keeping our horse in good nick, not in too good of a nick, okay? So don't think that fat and shiny is healthy, okay? Fat is not healthy in any sort of animal ever, okay? It increases our risk of it. Well, for one, it puts extra pressure on the joints, particularly if we do have a working horse, and we want longevity out of that horse. We don't want the extra pressure on those horses' joints, but it's also increasing our risk of metabolic disease. So anything that's overweight has an increased risk of laminitis or insulin resistance as well. So we want to make sure that we are keeping our horse in nice, healthy sort of condition to make sure that they are in their best possible health that they possibly can be, okay? And obviously everyone knows that we don't want an animal that is too skinny. So we do need to make sure that we are feeding our horses enough to keep them in good condition. So if you do have a particular poor doer, this might be a bit relevant to you. And if you have a particularly good doer, this might be relevant to you, particularly at the moment at springtime when there might be grass in your local area. I know there are some chunky monkeys where I keep my horse here. So yeah, always feeding for optimum condition. So always optimal weight, and then also optimal energy, okay? So when we're talking about energy, remember we're always talking about work and weight. So this is just Hygain products. I can help out with Mitavite products as well. But this is a really simple sort of feed finder, and it really drives home that sort of feeding for purpose sort of message, I think, anyway, because it's quite simple. And quite easy to sort of use. So you categorize your horse based on the sort of metabolism that it has. So this is about maintaining optimum weight here. And then this is about maintaining optimum energy. So energy is quite a personal sort of thing that we're talking about. Depends on the workload of the horse and depends on the actual type of horse in itself. So if you have a horse that's in quite a lot of work and maybe a little bit needs that energy to maintain their workload, then you would choose the high energy option. And then you just need to pick the category that fits your horse's metabolism. So if you find that they need about, maybe 2 dippers of feed a day or 1.5 dippers of feed per day, then you might be looking at something like Power Talk. Or if you've got, you need a horse that needs a low amount of energy or a very cool option, and they maybe need 3 dippers of feed per day, then you could be looking at something like Zero or maybe something like Ice. So feel free to take a picture or whatever you would like, but this is just a quick, easy way to sort of find a feed for your horse. And you should be able to put realistically any brands of feed you can fit into these sort of categories. And using this sort of simple method, you can realistically feed any type of horse. These are the 2 most important things that you really need to consider when you're choosing a feed for your horse. Do I have a good doer, a normal doer, or a poor doer? And do I have what sort of energy would I like from that feed? Okay. So just as a little bit of an overview, our take-home messages, we feed some sort of combination of fibre, starch, protein and fat, fibre being essential to make sure that that digestive system is nice and happy and healthy, starch being a great source of energy or also good for conditioning, protein again being essential, making sure that we're able to build those muscles and all other different types of tissues as well. And then fat being a good source of cool, slow release sources of energy and also good for conditioning. If we are looking for energy in the ingredients on the back of the bag, we want to look for starch. So any sort of cereal grains, corn, oats, barley, that's what's going to provide our energy for our horses, or that very fast sort of energy, quick release energy. And then we want to make sure that we are able to read the back of the bag of our feed so that we can identify those ingredients if we are looking for a higher energy feed or a lower energy feed. And then we also always need to make sure that we are choosing a feeding guide that matches our horse's requirements so that we are meeting those nutrient needs. And then we need to always remember that we're feeding our horse to maintain their best condition, meeting their nutrient requirements, and obviously for their overall health and well-being. So that's what I want everyone to take home tonight. And if you still need help, we're always here to help. So we do online diet analysis, but you can also reach out to me directly. So if you have any particular questions, you can all email me tonight if you like. Please don't all call me now. It's nighttime, but you can call me tomorrow. That's fine. Or send me a text. But if anyone is interested, we actually do offer a free online diet analysis. So you can go to this website, nutrikey.com.au, and create a little profile. It'll ask you all those questions that I went through about your horse. And we can actually provide you with a full breakdown of what you're currently feeding. And then we'll also provide you, doesn't matter what brands of feed that you're using, they're pretty much all in there. And if they're not, we can just add them in. And then we'll provide you a full breakdown of what we might have suggested. We will tell you if your diet is awesome, and we will also tell you if there's any tweaks that we recommend making, and we'll provide you with an actual written breakdown as to why we might have suggested that as well. So if anyone wants to, you are more than welcome to give NutriCare a go. Otherwise, reach out directly. But I hope everyone got something out of this. Thank you all for coming.
I've got a couple of more. There's a few more questions in the chat, Holly. Can you hear me okay? My Wi-Fi is not great.
No, you're great. So
Awesome.
let's go. What have we got?
The questions are, what vitamin and mineral supplement if no hard feed is given, and how much salt?
Yep, cool. Great questions. If you're looking for a great vitamin and mineral supplement, I obviously would recommend All Care. So All Care is our basic vitamin and mineral pellet. It's flavored with fenugreek, so you think it's a treat. So that's a great option. And being a pellet, it's easy to just feed by itself. So if you've got a really good doer or a paddock ornament, All Care is a good option there. It's 50 grams for a pony and 100 grams for a horse. With the salt, so generally for a horse, and we're talking very plain, basic table salt, the stuff that you could buy from Woolies, or your stock feeders will normally sell it in like a very plain sort of sack. For a horse, we're normally looking at about 2 tablespoons a day, so about 30 grams. And for a pony, usually about 15 grams, so about 1 tablespoon per day.
Okay, great. That was the next question. How much salt should be given per day? The next one is, if we are feeding optimally, why would a horse chew the bark off a tree, not wind sucking? Great presentation. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, people ask this question all the time. They'll say my horse is chewing the bark, or they could be licking like metal fences or licking the dirt, and they'll say my horse's diet is complete. Why are they doing that? Now, a lot of the time people assume that if they're chewing the wood that they're looking for some sort of nutrients. That assumption assumes nutritional wisdom, okay? So I don't wake up in the morning and think, ooh, I'm really deficient in manganese today. I better go and eat blah, blah, blah. So your horse is exactly the same. There is no evidence that suggests that they can pinpoint specific nutrients that they are lacking in. However, there is evidence that once they learn a behavior and enjoy doing it, they will continue. So if they're eating the bark of a tree, for example, they probably lack the texture, or they're bored, or they don't have enough roughage and they're just looking for something to eat. So obviously a horse will always seek roughage. They always want to have something going through that digestive system. That's important for their digestive health, and they just have a want to chew. So if they are starved of roughage, they might do that as well. But a lot of the time it's just because they've learnt, they lack the texture, they lack the taste, and they're probably going to keep doing it. If they're licking the dirt or they're licking a metal fence post, that's probably because it's salty. They lack the salts. Horses will seek salts. It's something that they generally do look out for. But apart from that, not much else. So that's very common with humans. We also like salty things. Or sometimes they like the texture of the dirt in their mouth.
Okay, and one more question. Is the best way to introduce some energy with fats and oils first and then gauge a response?
Yeah, so again, that kind of depends on what the horse has currently been eating. So if we do find, a lot of people don't have a very solid understanding of the energy content of their current diet. So if I found that your horse already did have some cereal grains in their diet, then we definitely could look at adding in a little bit extra for energy. But if you're starting at a base of very cool, no cereal grains, very low starch, low sugar, and you're a bit concerned about overdoing it, then fats might be a really good place to start. You just need to keep in mind with fats, if you have a good doer, it might not be the best place to start. So to be honest, good doers and energy is quite challenging, because anything that's adding extra energy, you can't add energy without adding calories. It's just impossible. Energy is calories, okay? So fat might be a great place to start. You just need to make sure that obviously we're not making our horse overweight, because we always want to keep their optimum condition. So yeah, maybe start with a source of fat if you've at a really, really cool sort of base. But if you've already got a bit of energy in your horse's feed, you may want to look at adding extra starch. Kind of depends on how much energy that you're really looking for. At that sort of level, when we're really starting to sort of tweak the diet, definitely reach out, because those sorts of really minute sort of tweaks, we can definitely help guide you in the best direction for your horse in that sort of situation.
Thank you. And then all the rest of the messages are just, you're fabulous, Holly. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for the information and the presentation.
Oh, thanks, everyone. Thanks so much for coming along, and thanks for listening. It's always a good time. And yeah, love hanging out with you all.
Thank you. I'm going to stop recording now.